Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of BPB Interviews. That's a show where I still don't have a name for the interview show. I'm Kyle Carty. Any and all pronouns, as always, are fine. Tonight's guest is Daniel D. Fox, the creator of the D100-based Grim and Perilous engine powered by Zweihander. Daniel's a multi-Emmy award-winning designer who's currently funding Flames of Freedom, an American Gothic horror game powered by Zweihander on Kickstarter, which is currently sitting at about, last time I checked, $54K on Kickstarter. He's also the executive creative director of games at Andrews McMeel. And if you want to learn more about him, all you have to do, as always, is type !guest into the chat. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody. Hey, thanks for having me, Kyle.
No problem. We're very happy to have you here. The way that we got you, I will say, is a bit atypical for us. Normally, I reach out to people on Twitter. I message them and say, hey, do you want to come on the show? You know, we're just starting off this small interview show. And more often than not, of course, I get ghosted because we're just starting off. We're a small interview show. But you showed up in our chat while we were playing Zweihander. I'm told that this is a thing that you do quite a bit, actually. So I figured, let's shoot the shot. What's the worst that can happen? He'll say no, but here we are.
I mean, one thing that I've really kind of tried to focus on over the last year is try to get a feel for who's playing Zweihander, because I'm always doing user-based research to understand how we can evolve game mechanics and evolve the game. So like I'm always like, who's playing Zweihander today on Twitch? And I set up a little Google alert for it because that's how I am. I guess I'm that guy. So yeah.
I mean, whatever works for you. You know, I have to have a bunch of alarms on my phone to keep stuff sorted too. So Google has been very, very beneficial to me as well. So, as always, for those of you who maybe are new here or haven't sort of seen any of these interviews before, we try to describe these interviews as something more of the 201 course for someone. So, basic information, we'll go over it, but if you're at all familiar with Daniel's work, then this is the one to listen to, because hopefully we're going to learn quite a few interesting things that maybe haven't been covered by some of the other very, very quality interviews that Daniel has participated in. So
I'm looking forward to it.
I mean, this is the first time I've put my foot squarely in my mouth about being confident, and that's usually, you know, pride cometh before the fall. That would be on my alignment axiom, would probably be something prideful. But let's get started if you're comfortable with that.
Sure. Yeah. Let's make it happen.
All right. So you are a self-proclaimed child of pop culture, which I think is true for most nerds. It's true for me. It's true for pretty much everybody in this chat. And Zweihander is full of glib pop cultural references. Of all of the ones that you've put into the book, which would you say is your favorite, excluding the smuggler's Hans shot first?
Yeah, that one's pretty on the nose. There's so many. So a real quick preface to this. I grew up on like late 80s, early 90s gangster rap. And when I was a kid, I was a breakdancer. So
What?
I was a breakdancer from age 11 until, still, I guess, as an old man that I am. But there's a lot of references in there. There's a couple Breakin' 2 references with Turbo, Ozone, and Kelly. But the one that probably stands out the most is so Ice Cube, The Predator, is one of my favorite albums, my favorite gangster rap albums of the 90s. And there's a talent,
choice.
You know, there's a talent called Sideways Gangster. It's called Gangster Grip. And the fluff text, the narrative, is literally taken from the self-titled song Predator that's in the book. That's one that comes to me immediately, at least.
That's a good one. I mean, I can't gloss over the dancing, because that is completely new information to me. So you know what? I'm gonna slot this one in as my immediate follow-up question. What drew you to dance? And do you like? Yeah, we'll start there. What drew you to dance?
So as a small town kid, kind of in the same realm of Footloose, not really, but I grew up in a small truck stop town called Oak Grove, and I think it was like around I was like 10 or 11. I started watching like breakdance movies, like, and my mom was like, my friend down in the little crossroads area, Oak Grove, it's a little 4-way stop, the flashing red light. She's a dance studio, and she's teaching breakdancing. So I took breakdance classes from ages 11 until I was 16. And I was always attracted to hip hop. Like that was like kind of like the music I listened to growing up is the music I listened to in my youth, my teenage years, and my young adult years, and I still listen to it now. My taste has certainly evolved, but that being said, I loved breakdance. So for my high school, this is so random. In order to graduate high school, you have to do community service. You have to do 10 hours. So in my 12th grade year, I taught breakdance lessons down at the YMCA. And although I'm 43 now, when I'm at weddings, I will break dance. There's photographic proof out there. I think I've shared a couple on Twitter. I have a video. My wife has this video. Oh, it's so embarrassing. Because I can't do the things I could when I was younger.
I mean, that's the case for any human that ages.
But I still pop and lock. I still do all the above ground stuff. I wouldn't call myself a b-boy, but I can still do my CCs. I can't do a windmill anymore. I do caterpillars and silly stuff like copy grinders, but I can't do like any of the stuff I did when I was younger. But yeah, I have been known to break dance when there's enough kerosene in the engine. And by that I mean when I'm properly lubed up with alcohol. So
I mean, gotta fire on all cylinders. So normally on this show, I will find an obscure photograph from someone's Instagram or their Twitter or like something that's way buried down there. And for you, I couldn't find anything that to me was of the caliber that I wanted it to be. Something that I could be like, what about this? I need to express just how jubilant I would have been if I found a picture of you popping and or locking on Twitter. That would have been my ace in the hole, dealt it out. Oh my, that is delightful. That is absolutely delightful. But moving a bit away from things like dance, I want to talk a little bit more about, I guess in this regard, things that are impacted by your childhood. So you have said several times that you pronounce Maine Gauche with a bit of an accent. And I believe that's a little bit of like Missouri mustard on it, unless I'm mistaken. As someone who has a Jersey accent that comes out plenty, but that I sort of keep a little quieter, what are some other words that you found still carry a bit of that non-broadcast or non-general American English that still sort of come out when you talk?
Yeah, so this is good. So yeah, I was born in the Ozarks, so a lot of that I have suppressed over the years, but I still find myself running words together like I'm going to the store, and I don't say to. Going to the store, like it's a T apostrophe.
No, we share that in the Jersey dialect as well. Although there's the upward inflection ends a little bit differently, I believe.
Yeah, a lot of use of the word folks, like them folks over there, y'all. That's a Southernism. Washing machine. I catch myself doing it all the time.
What is that one? Because
washing machine.
Worcestershire machine.
Yeah.
Ours. The big one that my wife does is Mira and Wada. Like it's very New York accent, and I kind of rib her for it all the time. But washing machine is a new one. I've never heard that. That's delightful.
Well, I've always heard that New York is like Wada, and the New Jersey is like water or water.
Water.
Like
Water. Yeah. It's water. So my wife, most of her family lives up in New York City, and so when she was a kid, she spent a lot of time up there, so she developed a lot of that New York affectation, even though she lived closer to like Philly. So it still comes up. And as someone who was very like central New Jersey, my accent and her accent, despite being like an hour-long drive apart from one another, are radically different. But let's talk a little bit more about shop, because we can talk about these fun things, and we will in the future. We will continue to talk about these fun things. But I want to talk a little bit to Daniel Fox as the expert. And you had an interview with John Hall where you talked about how local game stores relate to the tiers of RPGs, and how we're sort of seeing these evolving market trends amongst younger demographics, specifically like what marketing would refer to as like Gen Z, branching out into tier 2 RPGs like Savage Worlds, Zweihander, and Genesis. So taking into account your belief that any publisher not investing in online actual plays will lose the RPG arms race, what new market trends and opportunities are you preparing for or hoping to see within the next 5 years?
That's a really good question. I will caveat this by saying I'm not an expert. But I have an opinion. My opinions are pretty strong around this. So I think that obviously actual play is important. We know that. Good example. So Darrington Press was just announced today by Critical Role. And guess what? If Critical Role creates their own game system, they're going to unseat D&D. Just a reality of the situation.
Yes.
So I think it's like a case study in motion where we're seeing actual play groups begin to develop their own games. Another example that is Into the Motherlands with Tanya DePass, B. Dave, Gabe Hicks, Crystal Ariel, all those folks are working on developing a game in the open in which is completely fully paid for by Twitch. It's a sponsored show. So I think that we're going to start seeing some of these other. I think Twitch. I think Roll20. I think if other VTTs are smart, such as Roll or Fantasy Grounds, they will start developing their own bespoke RPG systems that are used in those channels. Another great example that's Burn Bright by James Picasso.
I was about to say, you're thinking more along the lines of Burn Bright then, something that is specifically designed for Roll20 being applied to other platforms.
That's right. And it's pretty clear that other parallel markets are looking at opportunity for RPG. A box set just came out for The Green Knight, a movie that hasn't been released yet but has a lot of hype. And it's a D&D based-ish game. Of course, we know Feast of Legend from Wendy's. Literally, I used to work at the place where it was created. It's down the road from where I'm at.
Oh, wow.
I think we'll continue seeing these kind of like, one-off marketing things that'll happen as promos for parallel mediums. Film is a really good example of that. But if you look at fandom as an example, they're with Cortex Prime being their center, they're kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak, for their RPG system. They just acquired He-Man. They're working on Transformers with Renegade. There's all kinds of different things that are happening in the background where old properties are being revitalized and then being channeled back through the lens of RPG. So I think that's kind of signaling the idea of the retro RPG, kind of stoking some of the nostalgia and sentimentality we have with our youth. I think this is kind of a natural movement for people in RPGs. People kind of go one of two directions. Typically, they either go toward whimsy and beer and pretzel games, or they go toward dark fantasy. You certainly have gray area in between. Don't get me wrong, but I believe the whimsical games and the games that are drawing upon nostalgia will become more popular, I should say, and more importantly, being developed by people who are diverse themselves, which is where they see the big publishers going wrong. So I think the big trend that we're going to see more and more over the next couple of years is that a lot of these new RPGs that will kind of break through the noise of D&D that's kind of happening there on social media. We'll see more games by diverse creators actually making it, I'm going to call it, quote, big time, but certainly getting placement in Barnes & Noble, placement in game stores, above and beyond just their social media presence, above and beyond kickstarting their own web store. I think it's probably the thing we're going to see here in the next probably couple of years, and there's already some great examples of it right now in the market.
Yeah, and that's all very, very interesting, because that's something that I've sort of discussed with people in our Discord before, is we're seeing the revitalization of projects and products like, Cortex Prime, which sort of tried to do this in the past and then fizzled out with like the Supernatural and the Battlestar licenses and things like that. But when you compare the market of now to the market of 10 years ago, we're talking about, like what you just said, was getting a product into Barnes & Noble might not be the greatest success. But when you consider that maybe a decade ago, when we were still in 4th edition for Dungeons & Dragons, there wasn't even really a role-playing section. It would maybe be a shelf with 4th ed books, and if you're lucky, a Pathfinder book. Nothing that doesn't utilize a D20 would be seen, except for sometimes Dragon Age. And it's funny how the goalpost has moved so far, like you're talking about, with now it being a possibility for some tier 2 games to get into Barnes & Noble.
Yeah. And there's a real desire, I feel, especially as role-playing games have become less about, you're playing in your basement, you're playing to the local game store. It's now happening in the open. It's happening with families. I mean, consider this. So people who start playing D&D, in the 80s and early 90s have children who are old enough to play games now. So of course they want to play games with their kids. So Barnes & Noble and Target and all these other stores are not they're responding to that need state, which is there's a desire to play games with families, especially at home in COVID. So I think that's kind of another, even though COVID is terrible, but really gaming in general, gaming in the home has grown, despite the fact that there is some trends in the market showing that hobby store books are not moving as well as they used to. Publishers are kind of skewing more toward Amazon because they get people who are Amazon Prime users, they get their games immediately. They don't have to go to the game store. They don't have to risk exposure to COVID. They don't have to go out in public. So it's a really interesting observation I've made. And I think that if you were to talk to other publishers, they probably talk about some of the same things that they're seeing, that, games for youth are starting to kind of rise up. Money Cook Games comes to mind, but No Thank You Evil, and Kids on Bicycles, things like that.
To sort of follow on this trend of meeting your market where they're at and evolving with your market, you've gone on record as describing Dungeons and Dragons as Bud Light, and not as an insult, mind you.
Yeah.
But you've said that in previous interviews, and I find it really funny because around here, the frequent parlance is D&D is the McDonald's of RPGs. Like, every now and then, I could really just go to town on a McDouble, but sometimes I want some other stuff. So I'd like to talk about probably the most serious and dire question of the night right now. If D&D is Bud Light and McDonald's, what beer and food are Zweihander or Flames of Freedom? They don't have to be part of the same meal.
Yeah.
But what would the analogy be if we sort of extended it beyond? I know this is grave. Good. This is dire. Please, no laughter. Yeah. This is a serious matter.
So I love this. This is awesome. Okay, so it's funny. I was just literally like a week ago, I was talking to my wife and we were just discussing food, and I was talking about RPGs, and she's like, I've been dating you we've been married for a while. I've been dating you for almost 8 years. Like, I don't know what your favorite food is. I was like, I think it's pho. And the thing I love about pho is that you have all these different ingredients you can mix together to custom blend your pho. So like, I like chicken pho. I like spicy chicken pho with sliced jalapenos. I don't like bean sprouts. But basil and cilantro and everything else you put into it, right? And we kind of make our own custom pho at home. So I'm like, if I was to compare Zweihander to food, it's probably pho, because I think that what's really unique about Zweihander, it's kind of a toolbox. So you can kind of mix and match and make things work together that you want. But at the end of the day, it's spicy. So Grim and Perilous gaming spice. Dark fantasy is spicy. I like to refer to it as horror fantasy. So I'm not saying that pho is horror food, but
it's the modularity that you're comparing.
Yes,
because pho is delicious. We finally found a good place around us, and so we've had it a couple of times during the quarantine when we just like we want something that's gonna like fill us up and feel good, and I'm not gonna feel bad about eating it. So I actually think that's a very apt analogy. I like that a lot, but don't think we can't gloss over the alcohol question. Is it a whiskey? Is it a beer? Where are we?
It's a whiskey.
It's a whiskey, yeah,
absolutely. So when I'm a whiskey drinker, I have a whiskey collection. I'm a serious whiskey collector. So my hobbies are role-playing games, Legos, and whiskey, and motorcycles at the far end. So whiskey, it has to be whiskey, only because I love whiskey, but I think more so because, once again, it's like some whiskey's good, some whiskey's but Zweihander, it has a certain taste to it. It's not a peaty whiskey. It's not like a Scotch. It's not like earthy and peaty. It's more robust. A little bit of caramel and chocolate on the palate, but it tastes like whiskey. I mean, going down.
Much like a whiskey, it's aged several years. You put a lot of time into the development before you even posted it onto the internet in its first playtest form. So I think the analogy holds on. But to talk a little bit more about whiskey, because my roommate used to be absolutely gaga about whiskey, and he would buy a bunch, and he was very generous about sharing with me and my wife. So what's something on your shelf right now that if you just really want to have what you would consider like the pinnacle of what you have Scotch or whiskey wise on your shelf, what bottle are you cracking open? How many years, peated, unpeated? What are you thinking?
So my go-to, like when I want like a really fine whiskey, and so I have, just to clarify, I have a bottle of the Black Pig, the Black Boss Hog Whistle Pig, which is expensive and doesn't taste so great. And then on the other hand is like Basil Hayden's, which is kind of it's great. But my go-to is actually a local whiskey from Rieger called Monogram. And Monogram, it's made in limited quantities, about 1,200 bottles a year here in Kansas City. What's unique about it is that the whiskey is mixed with sherry, and then it is aged in Boda cask. So it has a very unique flavor to it. And actually, what's interesting about this whiskey in particular is that a lot of whiskey prior to Prohibition were made with sherry and whiskey blended. But the only whiskey to this day that still uses the old formula with the sherry and the whiskey and the Boda casks is Monogram. They also have like a standard Rieger whiskey, which is okay. It's good mixing whiskey, but Monogram is like, you can drink that straight. It's nice. Just a little bit of water to like bring out the taste. Nice, rich kind of ruby red color. A little, almost looks a little bit like cough syrup, but it's not like the same consistency or viscosity. But you can taste the sherry in it. And it's so unique because most whiskeys, you go back, most whiskeys taste like whiskey. They have different tones and palates whenever you drink them, but Monogram is so unique, and I've really clung to that. I only have 2 bottles. I've got the 2018, the 2019. 2020 was made, but I didn't buy any because of COVID. But they're both amazing. But that's my go-to. It's the Monogram. If you can find it anywhere, it's amazing.
Here I was hoping that you were gonna come at me and sort of like give me like a slow ball or something that I could like bunt to like keep up in the conversation, but it's this like obscure, like it's like talking to someone in the punk scene and they just give you this like very out of nowhere crust punk band that you've never heard of, and you're like, oh yeah, I'd love to listen to them at some point. I gotta try it. And maybe next time I'm out in Missouri way, we have a couple of friends out there that we're hoping to visit eventually once the world goes back to some semblance of normality. I'll see if I can at least get a finger of it at a bar or something.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about bars, I want to sort of, once again, segue the conversation to something else. And that is something that you're not a big fan of, but hopefully I've earned a little bit of trust to get through the question. Trading card games. You're not a big fan of them. but you've described them as a snackable, digestible experience that you can walk into a bar with and just play. Mm-hmm. Is there a hypothetical equivalent that you can imagine one day existing for tabletop role-playing games? Something that will enable this sort of simple popcorn experience?
Yeah. Wow, that's really obscure. I think there's actually a game in the market right now that kind of ticks off in that box. It was created by the co-founder of Polygon and one of the lead editor of Verge. It's a game called Quest. It's a super interesting. For those of you who don't know, maybe you know about it, Kyle, but it's a really intriguing game that uses incredibly simple storytelling mechanics. In its position specifically for usability, which is really interesting because most RPGs are not focused on usability. They're focused on providing the core RPG experience. But Quest really distills it down into its most essential parts and creates a way to tell stories in ways that you could literally teach anyone how to play the game, because it's also partially card based. So it has that pick up and play sort of mode, which is kind of antithetical to the way most RPGs are created these days, which is they're complex. Even if you look at like old school Essentials, which is now like literally my favorite OSR game, comparatively it's still complex. But Quest is very, very simple in its approach, and it's hyper focused on everybody being able to play it and learn it very quickly, which is I think it's kind of a forgotten tradition of board game design, of role-playing game design. We have this intense desire to play complex games, and complex games tend to do really well in the market and on Kickstarter. So I think Quest kind of offers that bite-sized popcorn-style experience that could be picked up and played by practically anyone. And you all should definitely check it out. It's really interesting.
So do you see Quest as obviously not a direct mechanical heir, but sort of maybe more of a spiritual heir, or a progression into the direction that a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse systems or certain OSR ultra simplified games, or in the indie scene, even sort of like the one-page RPGs? Do you see Quest as part of that movement, but it is succeeding in that popcorn playability approach where maybe you could play it at a bar where other games might have failed? And if you do, what do you think is contributing to that success in a more specific way?
Yeah, so I think what's really intriguing about Quest, and TC, he's one of the creators on it. We had a pretty long conversation about this some time back. But what I think is really interesting is Quest is what happens when you take somebody who came into D&D, saw the complexity of it, but comes from a product design background. And when you take somebody who's a product designer, and then they design something they weren't born into, they don't inherently have the DNA connectivity that we may have to RPGs from our own youth. This is what happens when a project manager basically designs a product, designs a game. It's very interesting in that way. And because they take a very different approach, which is not a traditional RPG approach, let me be clear here. This is not rooted in like a foundation of like RPG design. This is coming from a product design perspective. This is why I think it's been so successful, why it was successful on Kickstarter, and why it continues to succeed in the market. I'm hoping to see it continue to grow. It kind of came around at a really interesting time too, when people were very, very upset at Dungeons and Dragons for doing something wrong. I mean, every other week something seems to be amiss with them, but no offense to my friends who work there by any means, but Quest came along at a very good time whenever people were kind of feeling a bit sour about the Wizards of the Coast, well, more specifically Hasbro experience at D&D. So Quest kind of filled that gap, and I've seen several actual play groups move away from D&D and go toward Quest, which is great because it also means now they're looking at games that are not D&D, which is more important. Like, try something else.
You've talked about that at length on Twitter or in other interviews, where you talk about how now that fifth edition's been out, fully released out for I think like 5 or 6 years at this point.
Yeah.
People are starting to migrate to other tier 1s or tier 2 or tier 3 games, Zweihander, Quest, Genesis to an extent. But it's very interesting because rising tides do raise all ships, and this sort of exodus away from that can be beneficial for other people. But Zweihander and Quest are very different games, mechanically speaking. And some would even say thematically speaking. They exist on very different ends of a gradient scale. But do you think that there are any lessons that you would take from some of these other smaller games that are coming out now, like a Quest or like Bolt or something like that, that you would apply moving forward to the design philosophy of Powered by Zweihander games, or even just if you had to do it all over again? Is there things that you think that you would incorporate with, these extra few years of game design experience and absorbing the game design experience of others with different perspectives?
Yeah, so I think that there's something, this really, I think, goes back to the strength of Quest, which is its ability to communicate what it is you can do in the least amount of words. Now, that's not always attractive from a sales perspective. People they want books with content. People desire content. So when you get a book that's less on content, you kind of have to supplement it with more art. Quest kind of strikes a really interesting balance between art and content. I think that for Zweihander, we kind of we over-index on writing. I think I can look backwards now and say, oh my gosh, why did I use so many words to explain something so simple and trivial? But I will say this, Zweihander's its initial intent beyond being Zweihander the role-playing game was intended to become a game engine. And our first iteration against that is now Flames of Freedom. And now that we're kind of near the end of the manuscript with Flames of Freedom and gone through the game design process, I'm finding that there are ways to quickly communicate the same things I said in Zweihander and Flames of Freedom with significantly less words, and also being able to focus more on legibility, UX. I think that's really where games that are lighter in content tend to do really well if they will over-index on usability, which Quest did. I keep going back to that because it's a great example of a model that I think all PG publishers should follow. But I think as far as it goes for Zweihander, I think, I can't with that. I'm under NDA, unfortunately, on this, but I think that you're going to see something a little bit lighter weight with Zweihander in the next year. It won't be like Quest, obviously, it'll be its own thing. However, it will be able to show off the strength of Zweihander as a game engine, both as, a big, thick, complex,
as a literal Zweihander
of,
is the running joke that I hear a lot.
Yeah. As little as Zweihander, that's right. Or as something, smaller and more compact, that still does the same thing, because every game has its own unique need state, its own unique rule needs. Like some games don't need to be as complex as they are. So Zweihander is built to where you can dial up the complexity or dial it down. But really, I think you'll see that in the next games we produce. Because Flames of Freedom, although it's kind of medium complexity compared to Zweihander, we got another one that's coming out shortly thereafter that's much lighter in complexity that will really show how flexible the engine can be. And I hope people see that.
Interesting.
But we'll find out.
So with Flames of Freedom then, because one of what I believe is the strong selling points of Zweihander is that it has that value of, you are going to get, the 3 core rule books worth in a single book. But one of the strong selling points that gets spoken of a lot is that you can, as a player, play Zweihander with only 8 pages. Is this sort of redistribution of words that we're seeing in Flames of Freedom, this sort of consolidation and conciseness that we're going to see, is this going to reduce the 8 pages of Powered by Zweihander into a smaller amount, or is it just going to condense the book overall to a slightly smaller size?
So our kind of core ethos of the development of the game was to ensure that we provided an experience, a play experience, for somebody coming to Zweihander or Flames of Freedom, able to play in 8 pages or less. We tick off on that box in Flames of Freedom as well. But unlike Zweihander, which was, here's a book of hundreds of options you can layer into your game that are well balanced, with Flames of Freedom, we are now over-indexing on content as it relates to the setting, because the setting has its own unique demands, right? So we're talking about 1776 America, re-envisioned through a lens of occult horror. So the book is going to be big. It's going to be 600 pages plus.
Okay.
But it will do what Zweihander did before, which is Player's Guide, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual, and Adventure all in one. But you'll have a lot of setting and thematic material to really help people understand how to take this very complicated and historically challenging time and turn it into something that's enjoyable around the table.
Okay, I like that. I'd like to talk about a strange fact that you and I share in our realities. Are you tense? Are you always worried by these lead-ins that I have that are intentionally worrying? So you and I have a unique problem that we share, and that is we have probably had to explain what a sabermetrician is to more people than anyone who isn't themselves a sabermetrician. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who are unaware, that's a fancy word for like baseball math nerd. My brother is a baseball math nerd. He's like a big baseball math nerd. And so is your editor, who helped you sort of maintain your hope for a bounded accuracy system in Zweihander with clear success percentages where people are sort of immediately aware of just how likely they are to succeed and no division involved in your rollings and things like that. And that shows in the Grim and Perilous system's primary roll system. And how much do you feel that such simplified and easy to follow math contributed to the self-same grim and perilous aesthetic that the flavor of the game is capturing? Mm-hmm. You know, where does the marriage of mechanic and thematic occur? And does the math contribute?
No, that's a really good insight. And yeah, I don't know very many people who know sabermetricians at all.
I have had to explain it so many times to so many people, and I saw you having to explain it quite a bit. So I was like, oh, well, here's a fun fact.
Yeah, so I think that the challenge that dark fantasy games have, and this is more kind of principled, the challenge that dark fantasy games tend to have is that they really lean into the darkness. So they believe that, and I don't know if this is like it seems to be a universal truth, dark fantasy games tend to be really complicated to play. And I don't know if it's just an aesthetic, or if it's part of the aesthetic, or if it's just the foundation of these people's experience, and therefore they create a complex dark fantasy game. But I feel that there is something to be spoken about elegance in game mechanics, because then it's an easier pill to swallow when you ask people to say, hey, play this this morally challenging game. Oh, and play these really complicated rules too. So if you can take away one of those things, which is the complicated rules, and really lean into rules elegance, it's an easier pill to swallow for people, because once again, dark fantasy games are typically rooted in a hyper masculine tropes, aesthetic, in complex rulings, and I think it's kind of tied back to the whole idea of the grognard, that there are these things that are kind of like they stand up to the test of time because I have earned my way into playing complex games, and you can never enter my walled garden. I feel differently about dark fantasy games. I think dark fantasy games serve a purpose beyond just men or people who identify as men. It's very clear that it does if you look at the demographics of people who are playing Dark Souls on Twitch right now, or Bloodborne. Dark fantasy and horror fantasy games appeals to a broad spectrum of identities. But, this is the big but, it has to be presented in the right way. And I think that by reducing rules complexity, it's an easier buy-in for people who are typically turned off by the art or by the complexity or by the aesthetic.
It's interesting. Sorry, you finish.
No,
Please
you're fine.
finish.
No, you're good.
I find it interesting that you say people that are turned off by the art, because one thing that is refreshing about Zweihander, and I'm gonna be honest with you, it took me a while to get into Zweihander, not because I didn't read it, but because when I hear it's a Warhammer thing, I'm like, uh-oh. Yeah. But I was delighted. There's actual like text logs of me messaging one of our moderators who eventually got me to play it and ran the first game I ever played with it. I'm messaging him and I'm like, oh, it's really cool that in here, like, it explicitly goes out of its way to tell you, like, hey, we're using they them pronouns. We're not doing the shitty assumption of like only he him pronouns because it means they them. It explicitly sort of talks about how your character's gender identity is very much a valid thing in this world, even though it is this grim and perilous world, and the art itself is very inclusive. Now that you're talking about the systems approach, would you consider, and this is a kind of a loaded question, but I'm hoping that everyone will engage with this one in good faith, would you consider the approach to Zweihander as an attempt at being intentionally anti-gatekeeping, not just not gatekeeping, but anti-gatekeeping in a field that is almost exclusively all about gatekeeping? Was this an intentional design, or was it just a happy accident that now has become intentional design? Because the staff working on Flames of Freedom, very impressive staff, a lot of incredibly talented people on there, and there's a lot of hard work being put into it. So could you please maybe enlighten us into a little bit of that?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. And I say that not because we said, okay, we're going to set out to be anti-gatekeeping. I think more so it reflected the values and principles of the people working on it. I mean, I don't want to out anybody who worked on the game by any means, but rest assured that Zweihander was developed by a group of people who were multicultural, who have different, they're not cis het, and with another person who is transgender, and of course, it's really hard to talk about these things because I guess to some degree it doesn't really click with me sometimes. And I'm like, of course I don't work with people who are extremely talented. Oh, and happen to not be beardy white guys. That's great. That's always a benefit because you get different perspectives and experiences from their own lives that influences the game. So I can say, our lead artist, Dan Mandich, so quick background, he's from Serbia. He is a war refugee from Bosnia-Herzegovina. He has fled 2 genocides. He's 44. He lives in the middle of Belgrade. You know anything about Serbian history? It's really bad. It's really violent. So when we set out to design the artwork for this, because he learned more about us and who we were and how we write and what we're trying to do, he's like, I think we should really make the artwork as inclusive as possible, so that we can show everyone on the game table. And we had this kind of like this moment of like clarity. It was like, wait a moment. We're not portraying the characters in the world wearing the armor and clothing and swords and weapons.
We're portraying the players
around the table. Yeah, the people around the table in these armor and clothing and settings. So that was kind of the key insight there. We're like, okay, this is the linchpin to our design and our aesthetic. Like this is our audience too. It's the people we want to play the game who are like us. So leveling that up to Flames of Freedom, especially with the really challenging time period. What I guess what I'm saying is what the game world doesn't need, right, is another white person sugarcoating history. We need the voices of people who have lived experience, who are marginalized, POC, Black, transgender, who can speak from experience, and even better if they have a scholarly experience. So with Flames of Freedom, especially with our Indigenous chapter, we have 16 cultural consultants that we're working with that represent each of the nations we represent in there. When we talk about Black characters in Flames of Freedom, it's written from the perspective of Black RPG writer. So it's just when we talk about women through the lens of Flames of Freedom, which like patriarchy is like a long-standing thing in America. So we have women write those perspectives. So it's not to say that people who aren't white and beardy like me can't write those things, but it's better informed if it's written by the people that you want to portray in the game. So it has become, I guess, in a way, it has grown to become something that we're like super anti-gatekeepy, in so much that we say, if you intend to use this book for, for I don't know, practice slavery or genocide in your game, like, don't buy this book. We don't want you playing the game. In fact, One Angry Gamer, it's a well-known like hate website.
Fucking Christ.
They created this list of race traitors. I'm on it. And
I did not know that they created a list, but that is absolutely some shit they would post.
Yeah, so they post a list of race traitors. I'm on it. I don't typically get involved in online drama, but then I found this was interesting because we're signaling, and I wouldn't call it purchasing, but we're signaling that, yeah, we're inclusive. Of course we're going to include this stuff in our game because we ourselves are diverse in perspective and experience in gender and culture and religion and whatever else may be. Of course our games are going to reflect that. Of course it's going to. And the reality is that most younger gamers are not, who are coming in through, D&D, whatever else it may be. Those are the things they desire. They want to see themselves in the game. They want to see themselves in the artwork. They want to see themselves in the writing. They want to see those perspectives in the game. So, yeah, I guess in a way we have kind of made a choice to be anti-gatekeepy in the sense that we will tell people, do not play our games if you're this kind of person. We don't want your money. And honestly, I think it's good for publishers and companies in general to fire their customers. Because you have to, because you don't want those people controlling the conversation or reflecting your product in a way that isn't true to who you as a writer or designer is.
Yeah. By the way, everyone, this was a question about math. Just it's nice to see, because there are a lot of blunders that, in the tier 1 or the equivalent of the AAA space that we see happening right now. I mean, ironically enough, Orion, they posted about the Darrington thing today and said very similar things to what you were saying. And, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the unfortunate situation that they found themselves in at a certain massive company. But it is nice to see these things being taken seriously, because we are an explicitly leftist channel. Like that is very much in our DNA. But to see that inclusivity is very heartening, and I was very excited because once again, I'm not going to lie to you, I had concerns about Flames of Freedom going into it, and I'd still like to read it and talk about it with my play group and sort of everybody that I talk about these things with before I fully pass judgment on it. But I will say, after researching the Kickstarter, I'm much more confident in the product than I was when I asked you to do this interview last month.
Yeah, and it's a legit concern, and we knew people would be concerned about it. We had to make the right choices when it came to who we hire, and when we looked at who we freelanced this to, we looked at experienced designers and inexperienced designers, because there's value in both, and you have to pay them both well, because inexperienced designers can't learn unless they're working with experienced designers. Doing it on your own is sometimes really difficult for people. So I think that especially with the team that we had for Flames of Freedom, it's kind of, I think it's imparted, I hope it has at least, it's imparted some learnings that people can apply moving forward to other projects they take on. I mean, if I have my druthers, Flames of Freedom will continue as a big product line, and we'll continue working with the same people. But of course, schedules change, people's work schedule stuff change. Gabe Hicks, like he's working on the new Darrington Press board game. He's working
I didn't know
for
that.
Paizo. Yeah, he's working for Mage Hand. Like he's like blown up, and he's
very fast too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I big fan of his stuff. I if you're familiar with Metal Weave Games, the Baby Beast area, Andreas, we sort of got in touch very briefly in a different conversation, but that's neither here nor there. I'd like to change gears a little bit. You have worked a lot of jobs. You've done graphic design, advertising, business development, game design, and plenty of stuff in between. To sort of get a little bit more towards a different topic. What is a maybe weirder job that you've previously held that you still sort of find yourself thinking back to now and then? Like, what's the weird one?
So when I was 19, there. I had oh my gosh, this is a good question. So I had this dream, like when I was like a dream, but like 19, I didn't know anything. I was like, I'm going to get my bounty hunter license.
What the fuck?
So the path to that was repoing cars. So I worked for a used car lot and I was paid $100 bounty to reclaim cars that people had lapsed on their lease for. And this is like a really pernicious practice, by the way. Keep in mind, this is 1996. So to frame this up correctly. So my friend Tim and Phil, his younger brother, and Rick and I, we reclaim cars. I think my time was maybe 4 months over one summer. And eventually I didn't pursue it because it's dangerous. I'd like to note, because people don't like their cars being repoed. And typically it's done in the dead of night. So, of course, in this sense, like in the middle of Missouri and Oak Grove and surrounding environment in the eastern Jackson County area tends to skew a little more gun heavy. So I wouldn't say we were never faced down by anybody by any means, but it was always a gamble. We never knew what was going to happen. We were fortunate that we never we never got caught because we were really good at what we did. But of course, we had like an extra key and we would have lockpicks and things like that. Wasn't on the up and up. I'm going to be very clear here. But knowing what I know now, it's weird to think back on. And it was a really strange job, but we got paid really well to do it, and we did it in the dead of night. I haven't thought about that in years. Oh my gosh,
it's a job to grow from.
Yeah.
Normally I get like mine is like I'll tell a story about being like a overnight security guard at like a building, or the time that I used to manage a parking lot near a beach and extort people to give me cases of beer as like a 17-year-old kid so they could park there and I wouldn't tow them. But I think you got me beat on that one, man.
That was not my intention, but I think it's probably the most random job I ever had. And literally after that, I started my 2-year career at Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Oh,
so
the tenure, the prestige.
That's right.
So, a question to sort of round out the interview. Looking forward, obviously, Flames of Freedom, it's already funded. It's doing very, very well. But you've talked about other projects here and there in the past, and I'm just hoping to see if maybe there's an update on one of them. And maybe it's my called shot. Obviously, if I'm putting you in a pickle, you don't have to confirm or deny anything. But I'm hoping to ask about the tentatively titled Peacemaker. You're obviously focusing on other things, but is this grim and perilous Wild West game still sort of kicking around in the back of your mind? And if it is, what are you thinking about regarding it?
Yeah, Peacemaker is like kind of a big dream project of mine, and I keep kicking the can down the road because we keep getting bigger IP put in front of us now. So it becomes less of a focus. I think that if we could find the right IP to bring forward that played to the kind of like weird Western stuff, we could probably do it. I mean, I technically have like 100 pages of it written already in Google Docs. But I can't do anything with it because I'm so hyper focused on our next big thing. This is the NDA life, of course.
Of course.
So we've got an announcement actually coming before end of year about a really interesting new IP that's being worked on by a group external from us out in LA that's working on a Powered by Zweihander game. We'll hear more about that soon with a kind of a mind-boggling cast of people who are mostly outside the RPG industry. Some RPG industry veterans, but the lead designer and the lead writers are actually outside the industry, so it's going to be kind of interesting.
Oh wow!
It's a horror fantasy game in the same vein as Zweihander. It's powered by Zweihander, coincidentally. And then, so James Etricasso is currently working on, and I think some people know this, but we haven't really made an official announcement on it yet, but I think it was talked about on Twitter. He's creating a big feature-length campaign for Zweihander. It's currently working through right now. We're envisioning 300-plus pages, so go from basic tier to advanced tier, so beginning to end. In the same vein that you may think about Icewind Dale or Descent into Avernus, but one that has more content that's kind of dark fantasy-ish, but takes characters from beginning to end. So that's coming in 2022. The previous game, the horror fantasy game, is coming in 2021, right after Flames of Freedom, and we will have an announcement about that soon. It's super soon.
Good. I'm excited.
Yeah.
So with that, that's sort of all that I have prepared. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, I have two things for you, actually.
Of course.
So first on the whiskey thing, if you're in Kansas City, and we're outside of COVID, we'll go. I'll take you on a whiskey tour around Kansas City.
I will take. I will hold you to that.
Yep. You got my where I'm at. Or you got my Discord. I'll give you my number after this. Second, if you're interested in taking Flames of Freedom for a test drive, I can share with you the playtest documents that are. It's 90% of the manuscript is done. So if you want to take it for a test drive on your channel, I'm more than happy to send it your way.
One of our there's three main of us, and one of us is in the chat right now, and she is very excited about both of those propositions. So what I will say is, yes, we would love to take a look and read through it and then sort of make that decision. But it seems like a lot of us are receptive to that.
Yeah. Obviously the quick start is out there. It's a little free 61-page thing, but the play test is big.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll give you everything. Yeah.
I'm always looking
to share that with you.
I'm always looking to more stuff to read as I'm trying to unwind after a busy day. So absolutely, we'll hook up offline and see what we can do about that. That's gonna do it for us today. If you have just joined the chat, or maybe you still want to learn more about what we talked about, please !guest in the chat. It will take you to the Twitter and the Flames of Freedom Kickstarter. If you're listening to this in a podcast or VOD form, it's twitter.com/VihanderRPG, and you can just Google Flames of Freedom Kickstarter. I don't have a handy dandy one for there. I'm sure there's a handy dandy one on your end that you'll love to. If you want to follow us, twitch.tv/bestpalbrigade or twitter.com/BPBgames, facebook.com/BPBgames. We put out a lot of good high quality content. Hopefully there will be something there that you enjoy. Daniel, is there anything that you would like to plug here at the end?
I know I'm supposed to do these things where I'm supposed to talk about the Kickstarter we're working on, and thank you for graciously posting the link in the chat. The only thing I don't want to plug anything. I just want to ask people to continue wearing your masks, wash your hands, and please vote. Vote.
That's everybody's sign off really recently. Yeah. Everybody who's come on has been almost that exact same outro. So yes, please do all of those things. Dear God. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Have a lovely evening, everybody. We will see you later.